couple weeks ago, I blogged about some experiments that I had done installing WSL2, or the Windows subsystem for Linux, on my local development machine. And that initial blog post, which I reference here, and I'll put a link to in the notes. Well, basically, I wanted to document, the setup process, a little bit about WSL2, although there wasn't a whole lot to getting it set up. A little bit about the advantages of it, the fact that the file system is available here even from the rest of Windows. So, for instance, here I can go into my Linux distribution. I can see the file system right here in Windows and get really nice interaction. But the initial blog post that I did was really focused on getting HUN Express set up and installed into WSL2, which worked really well, and I've been using it ever since. I've updated and actually done a couple installs of HUN Express into this environment, and that's the way I've been using HUN Express lately. But today I wanted to experiment with something a little bit different. I've been reading about using the Windows subsystem for Linux to do local development in VSCode. And the idea is, today when I do, say, VSCode development, I do Cloud Application Programming Model or Fiori development, I need all of my additional tools set up in my main Windows system. So, for instance, I'm here, and I'll just show you. I've just got a command window here open to my local environment, and this is my machine. This is my native host OS. Microsoft Windows 10 Enterprise Edition. And if I were to do development in VS Code by default, it would run in this environment. So that means I need things like, just clear this. I need to have Node.js installed locally in my Windows host installation. So I've got, version 12, patch 19 of Node.js installed here in Windows. And it does mean if I need to do development, I want to, say, experiment with a different version of Node.js to test something out, I have to maybe disrupt everything that I'm doing here in my Windows development environment to install a different version of Node.js. Like I have, let's see, is it CDS-V? Yeah, CDS-V. So I have the Cloud Application Programming Model, the additional tools installed in my environment, and that's installed via Node.js package, but it's installed in the Node.js that's running here in Windows. And likewise, if I want to experiment maybe with a different version of Node.js, yeah, I could uninstall globally and install a different version globally. But the whole point is I sort of have just one development environment that's impacting also the runtime of my main operating system as well. This is where I execute things for real, right? And maybe it would be nicer if I could isolate my development into a separate container, but without the overhead of needing a remote container. I could use WSL to containerize a little Linux distribution and allow me to do my development on my local machine still, using VS Code running locally and attaching to my local Windows file system and being able to easily get content in and out of there, but do that in that containerized environment. The other advantage that I'm going to have with setting this up, if everything works out okay here, is when I execute code in VS Code, instead of running in the Windows operating system, it will actually be running in the Linux operating system. And this gives me a better test and debug environment that's going to match more closely to when I deploy my code to, say, the cloud platform, to Cloud Foundry or the Kima runtime, which of course is going to be running the code containerized in a Linux kernel there as well. Just gives me a much better match to the target environment that I'm ultimately going to be deploying in. So I want to set up I already have WSL set up, and you can refer to the earlier blog if you want to see some details about that, some links to resources to help you get it set up in your environment, and particularly WSL2, the latest version of Windows Subsystem for Linux, because there are some significant performance improvements that we see with that latest version. What I want to do now is I want to look into creating a copy of my Linux distribution so I can set up a separate container, a separate image just for doing cloud application programming model development on my local environment. So let's actually start here by looking at what Linux environments I have already installed. So if I just come to my command prompt here, let's just clear that up. And let's do WSL list verbose. And what you see here is I've got one default Linux runtime here running OpenSUSE Leap 15.2. That's actually where my HANA Express is installed. I'm not going to mess around with that. I actually want to use a really lean, pretty bare bones Ubuntu installation. And that's what I want to use as the baseline for my development containers. You see here I also have Docker set up, and it's using WSL2 as well. Come back to that later because I think we're also going to get a really nice feature here where because Docker is running in WSL2, we can actually share our central Docker installation across all our Linux distributions, and we don't have to duplicate images or do any special setup to get access to a single Docker instance from inside the specific Linux distributions that are running here. But let's take a look at this Ubuntu, and I'm using Windows Terminal here, and I can just directly open a shell to that Ubuntu image. So let's just go to my home directory here. There we are. So here I am looking at my Ubuntu. Let's just do a cat, what is this? Etc OS release. And there you see I'm running Ubuntu version 20. So give you some idea of what I'm running over here. I don't think I've got just a whole lot of stuff installed. In fact, here I am in my main directory. There's a few things. I think I did install Node.js. Yeah, a basic version of version 12 of Node.js. I know 14 is out in long-term support, but kind of waiting till more of the SAP modules have been updated and verified that they work on version 14 before I switch my development platform to that. So I'm going to stick with 12 for now, which is still in support. But in the future, I might want to switch over to 14 and be able to do it in an isolated environment. This is going to help me with that. So I've got the basic tools here. I think Git is installed by default. So I've got most of what I need here. Maybe just I'm here in my home directory. Just maybe create a projects directory where I could start doing development in. Yeah, it's empty right now, but good to go here in the future. Maybe already, I'll just show you Docker PS. So Docker, I just did a listing of Docker containers that are available and running, and you see I'm running Portainer here on port 8000. That's actually not running in this version of Ubuntu. If I launch this is my other window. Give me just a second here to bring it over. If I look at my Docker installation, I have Docker desktop installed. So Portainer is actually here in the main, in my main instance of Docker, because I think if I come over here, Docker PS. Yeah, I see the same Portainer installed and available here. And that's not because I've got a Docker server running in both Linux and Windows. I actually have a single Docker image here, and it is set up. If we look at the general settings of the Docker image, it's using WSL2, and that was some of the, you see the Docker desktop data. One of the really cool things that we can do here is WSL integration, and it will automatically enable integration into your distributions. And to add that, I just clicked it on for the Ubuntu distribution, and that gave that distribution automatic access to my central Docker. So if I'm using Docker for development in one of these localized WSL2 distributions, I don't need to duplicate images or my Docker setup or resources allocated to Docker. It's actually going to be connecting to the central Docker here that my Windows development environment would also be connecting to. So it's really nice, if I build an image locally and I have it available in my local Docker desktop, then I can access it without making a copy of it from the Windows side as well. So very resource efficient way of sharing Docker here between my distributions. So I've got I've got this Ubuntu distribution the way I want it as a baseline here. And I can just start doing development in it. But what I want to do is I actually want to take a snapshot of it. So I always have like a clean version of Ubuntu that I can go back to. But I want to create a version of it. I want to create a copy of it, if you will, specifically for doing cloud application programming model development. And it's something that I could maybe throw away and update independently, things like that. So what I want to do is I want to start with WSL. Actually, I want to see what. Go back up a directory here. So I want to say WSL, and I want to, sorry, I got all the commands over here in my other window to make sure I don't mess them up. Not things that I run every day, but so WSL, and then say export, and I want to export my Ubuntu, and I can give it a file name. So let's just call it Ubuntu as well. And this will take a minute to export. So I'll actually pause the video while this runs, and we'll come back here in just a minute once it finishes. That's complete now. What did that take? Took 4 minutes. That's not too bad. And what we should see now, if I go to my file system, is I got a file named Ubuntu, and I guess I should probably have named that ubuntu.zip. Let's just go ahead and change the file extension there. 3 gigs. That sounds about right for a complete Linux distribution with its whole file system and the little bit of additional content that I had installed there. I think we can even open this up and take a second to open. Yeah, there's our Linux file system. So we've got a complete export of our image, and now what we can do is we can go ahead and re-import this and give it a new unique name. So we can say WSL and --import. And we want to give it a name, Ubuntu Cap, for doing cloud application programming model development. And our installation location, let's just say, I probably should have made a directory here. First, I wasn't thinking ahead there, was I? So let's just go to directory Ubuntu Cap. All right, so now we can go back over here and we can say we want to install that into my Ubuntu Cap directory. And where do we want to get the file name from? That's our Ubuntu zip. So we will go ahead and start the import. And once again, I assume this is probably going to take about the same amount of time that it took to do the export, a couple minutes. So I'll go ahead and stop the video and we'll start back up once it's complete. All right, that import was pretty fast. It only took about a minute. And we can verify now, if I just do a WSL list verbose, now I see I also have an Ubuntu-cap as this completely separate Linux distribution image, separate running. This is not running at the moment, but we can go ahead and do a WSL-D Ubuntu-cap to shell into it. There we are. Now we're running inside that distribution. I guess we could even come back over here just to prove to you that it is running now. List verbose. Yep, it is running now. So there we have. We see a little bit of the logon information about it. But we're now running inside here. If I were to do let's just go to my home directory and there we have our initial look here. Yeah, where am I at? I'm in root. Oh, I must be logged in as root and not as my user. I'm used to usually just opening a new shell here. So let's just go ahead and add that as a configuration option here to my Windows terminal. So let's find Ubuntu and oh, there it is. It was already added. Yeah, okay. There it is. There we are. Now I'm logged on as my user, which is what I want. There we are. And it's still root. There we are. There's our projects. Let's see. It's very interesting that I got logged on here as root. I did not expect that, because if I go into my original Ubuntu and I do a who am I, and I'm logged on as my Windows user. But when I'm logged in now in this copy, I'm logged on as root. I did not really expect that to work differently, but perhaps when I imported the distribution, there's something different about the way that works. I'm interested now. Help import. Let's see if there's a options version. I don't see any additional options there. I mean, it's not the end of the world. It just is acting a little differently than what I expected. That's okay. So it's half the fun of playing around with something like this is figuring out that something's a little different than what you expected. So let me go ahead here and go to home. There we are. We're in projects. Now, I think if I do... Yeah, so my Node.js version came over. Git, it came over as well. I'm interested. I don't even remember if I installed the CDS command. Yeah, evidently I did. CDS-v So it came over as well, but let's maybe check real quick here and see if there's an update. npm install globally SAP CDS DK. Let's see if it needs an update. Well, isn't that nice? I got an access permission denied. Okay, I have to admit, I'm not exactly sure what problem I hit there. Perhaps because the Node module had been installed before I exported it, and then maybe the permissions are slightly different on the imported distribution. All I know is I did that uninstall right at the end of the video before I paused it. Then I did a reinstall now, npm install globally SAP CDS DK, and now everything's working fine. If I do my CDS-V, actually did get updated. That was just one minor level update, 4.2.8, but at least now I know my permissions are set up right, and I shouldn't have problems moving forward, hopefully. Like I said, kind of watching me experiment here. This is the first time I'm running through this. I didn't practice it in advance or anything. Yeah, as I run into stuff, we're learning about it together. But I seem to have the cloud application programming model not only installed and working in my local environment, but in this separate Linux distribution image. But now I also I've been able to update it. Now, one other thing that I want to check, if you remember earlier, my Docker, I want to make sure that my Docker is going to be available to this new copy of Ubuntu. And let's just check real quick here. If I go into WSL integration, yeah, we only need to turn that on. But to get that forced in, I'd have to restart it, because I do want to make sure that I have Docker available in this environment as well. And I don't know if that's enough to get it, or or if it has to restart. User. Yeah. There we are. And yeah, so here I am in my new distribution, and yes, I can see I can get access to Docker. So what we want to do here, I'm in my home, and if I go to projects, this is where I want to do development. So nothing in projects, but what I can do is I can just do a code dot. And this will work. Why did that not work? Did I do that right? Yeah, that should have worked. It should have launched my VSCode. And okay, I had to do a little searching for the solution here. Evidently, when you install a new distribution like this, the path doesn't get injected right away. So what you have to do is basically close your terminal window and open a fresh one. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Let's go ahead into my Ubuntu cap. And I'm going to do a switch user to my user. Go into my projects folder. And now, fingers crossed, when I do code. No. And I think this still has to do with how whatever's going on here with the different default user. Because actually, if I go back to my main user here, and I go to I misspelled it. And now, if I do code, yeah, now it works. So something isn't right with compared to my original distribution, where it was set up to use my logon user directly, and now when I made that copy and the defaulting to root, something isn't quite right there. It's not setting the path or the profile for my other user. Something for me to maybe play around with later, but for my purposes of what I want to do in this separate container, I guess it doesn't really hurt for me to be logged on by default in root. I was trying to go back to the way it had been before, but like I said, something for me to maybe look into. But what you see here is my projects no longer looking at a local file system, but my VS Code is running here. This is still my version of VS Code that's running on my Windows machine, but it's connected remotely into my Ubuntu image. And in fact, if I open a terminal, what you see here is, once again, if I do cat etc os release, I'm connected to Ubuntu. And, if I do a run or a debug, I don't have a project yet, but if I have a run or a debug, it's going to be running in the Windows subsystem for Linux. If we see here, we also have we still have access to Docker, but we have the central Docker, like we saw before. We can see that we're targeting and currently editing on Windows subsystem for Linux Ubuntu Cap. We have the ability to switch to other distributions or bounce between distributions here as well. I think we can even do a remote explorer, and it shows us our various WSL targets, and we see which one that we are connected to now. Yeah, it's interesting the differences in configuration there. It's definitely something I've got to play around with, but you see how nice it is that we're connected in here. The other thing is my extensions. It did automatically load all my extensions. See, no extensions found. I can see the extensions that are available in my base installation. And this is one of the things that I like is I could take just a subset of those extensions. Maybe I'll search here for, it's not cap. Let's just do SAP. And what you'll see here's our core data services, language support for SAP Cloud Platform, core data services, cloud application programming model, and you'll see that it says install extension to enable. So it's installed in my main version of VS Code, but now I can install it into my this version. So it allows me to have separate out and have different sets of extensions that are installed per remote container as well. So now if I just come back here, let's clear this out. And we see inside here, the only one that I have installed is the Core Data Services plugin for Visual Studio Code. I might want to install a couple others, but maybe not everything that I have in my main installation. Maybe gives me a lighter weight experience here, or the ability to play around with, different sets of extensions. Maybe I also want the REST client installed in my in this local environment as well. So let's, and now I would have the ability here in my projects. Let's just do CDS init. And, now I could be off and doing development here in this environment. Like I said, I'd be executing it in my Windows subsystem for Linux in a little isolated container. All right, and just to close out, I thought, how can I really prove that I'm executing and debugging in Linux here? So I just wrote a little Node.js script using the OS module that's going to go and grab OS level information like the platform, the architecture, and the release, and it will output that. Set that up as the start script in my little project here, and then just told it that set up a run command here to execute that. And just once again, my VS Code is running in Windows. So haven't really installed VS Code, or I'm not running it somehow from Linux. The VS Code is running in my host OS, which is Windows. But when I come here and I kick off my run script, which attaches to and runs code, it is running in my Linux container, and we'll see the output here that we're getting. The platform is Linux, the type is Linux. In the debugger, you're seeing this. If I continue, then an output to the OS, and same here. That is running in Linux. You even see the release here is actually the kernel. The Linux kernel is a Microsoft Linux kernel, Microsoft provided Linux kernel, and then the distribution runs, the Ubuntu distribution runs on top of that kernel. So isolated development, control over the development environment. Didn't go perfectly with me making the copy of my distribution and setting that up. I have to do a little more research on why the default username changed, and I had a little permission problems there. But ultimately, I was able to set up an isolated development environment in a copy of my Linux distribution, can connect from VS Code running in my on my host OS to that distribution and do development remotely there, and install my Node.js and my Node modules like the Cloud Application Programming Model and even VS Code extensions locally in the container and not in my host OS to keep my configuration all very clean and the setup very separate and very isolated. So I hope you enjoyed this little video. It wasn't meant to be an extensive look at something. Kind of like I said, following along as I experiment. I hit some roadblocks and we work through them together. I think that's kind of fun. Hopefully you enjoyed the video as well, and we'll have more of this sort of thing in the future.